The Legiones Astartes were the greatest army the galaxy has ever known. Created by the God Emperor of mankind, they were his bulwark to drive back the darkness of old night that had brought humanity to its very knees. Led by his demigod Primarchs, each legion had its own methods, specialty and culture that separated it from their cousin legions, and for the most part came into their own with the reunification of their respective genefathers. Beforehand, however, is a completely different story, as many legions, despite sharing many of the same legionaries, would be almost entirely different from their modern counterparts. Many had entirely different heraldry, combat tactics, and some didn't even have a traditional name, more their legion number or a moniker the public or their cousin Astartes would give them. But first, if you like these kind of videos and want to see more of them, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'm finally upping the tempo on my uploads to start posting weekly, so this is the perfect moment to join the family. I appreciate you all being here. It's been absolutely great sharing my interest in obscure subjects that capture me in the 40k setting, and I'm super excited to share it on a weekly basis. Alright. Let's get back to the lore.
And they shall know no fear.
A good example of the differences between the pre-Primarch and Great Crusade Space Marine legions would be the precursor to their now honorable and iconic Blood Angels, the Revenant Legion. The Revenant Legion, for context, more resembles the modern day World Eaters compared to their angelic-inspired counterparts. Their actions during the Unification Wars being that, for a lack of a better word, sheer barbaric violence. Often recruited from the most downtrodden and lost children of Terra, these Astartes would fight the most dangerous battles possible against easily the most vile and wretched enemies the techno-barbarians could cough up. But the most notable thing about them was their tendency to eat the corpses of their fallen enemies, earning them another nickname, the Eaters of Death, which, fun fact, resulted in a cult popping up revering the 9th Legion, which of course was swiftly and violently put down. This did not stop, however, as during the Great Crusade, somehow they did end up getting worse, devolving into more violent methods of combat, to a point where the Emperor was about ready to censure them like the 11th and 2nd Legion. But when Sanguinius was discovered, he helped the Legion, for a lack of a better word, calm down. Their color scheme and heraldry were practically non-existent. Their Legion banners and pauldrons just showed their Legion numbers, and while their armor was a flat steel, more often than not it could be seen that their armor was a dark muddy brown or red. Because, you know, of how much dry blood would accumulate on their armor. Compared to the artistic and noble Blood Angels, these guys seem like total animals. And to be fair, they were very close to this. But that is not the only legion to have a similar fate. The Space Wolves, before reuniting with Leman Russ, were simply called the Rout. The Rout were essentially the Emperor's personal legion, but what made them unique is that them, alongside the Salamanders in the Alpha Legion, they were held back for most of the Unification Wars, not seeing much combat outside of specific operations. When the Emperor did deploy them, he wanted their brutality and insatiability to come out in the forefront, and to be used to make examples of worlds and empires, to treat them to the worst fate possible known to a Space Marine Legion. Now, these tendencies tend to not be very good in a soldier long term. And this is exemplified by the fact that there was a specific arm of Space Marine legionaries called, and I'm probably gonna butcher this name, the Consul Obsequiarii Officers, which were basically the military police but for the Imperium forces at large. The Rout ended up having the most of these officers within their legion to try to temper the wrath and violence they were prone to fall to, showing that even the Emperor himself could not quarrel his favorite weapons. The Dark Angels, before meeting Lionel Johnson, were known by a few names. Sometimes they were called the First, but more commonly they were simply known as the Angels of Death. In fact, this legion, more than any other pre-unification, were the ones the Emperor trusted the most. Them being secretive was just a coincidence with their later chapter in Primarch. The reason they ended up so secretive is that they were made to always hide the secrets of what they destroyed. They may have killed entire legions, we know they killed the Rangdang, and they destroyed them so much that people didn't even want to speak on them anymore. In fact, their first true deployment was at the destruction of the Thunder Warriors, where the future Dark Angels would massacre their progenitors alongside their Custodes allies. In such a manner, only a handful of Thunder Warriors would survive the ordeal. Even during the Crusade and after the reunification, the First Legion would hunt down many of the surviving Thunder Warriors, making them the Emperor's personal assassins outside of his normal Terran assassins. Even their original heraldry and symbol was that of the Grim Reaper. Needless to say, this legion was the epitome of what the Emperor wanted in a Space Marine Legion. Efficient, quiet, and willing to do whatever was needed for the Imperium, no matter how unsavory it could be. Speaking of secretive legions, the 20th Legion, now known as the Alpha Legion, always existed with Alpharis within its ranks, except they didn't actually know this. We don't really know what their name originally was, or what their heraldry or anything really looked like, because what they did during the Great Crusade is a complete mystery. Many would even go as far as to call them the Ghost Legion. They were stealthy, they relied on subterfuge, but what we know mostly is that they really tended to operate in the background, even when they would attack in large numbers. Not much is known about their exploits, and most of it is hearsay. We do know they were present at the Rangdang genocides, but past that it's largely a mystery. By contrast, the Luna Wolves were far more well known. Their time as a legion pre-unification was relatively short, as Horus Lupercal was found almost immediately by the Emperor during the Unification Wars. But what would become the Luna Wolves and later the Sons of Horus was quite well known throughout the Imperium. They earned their name during the pacification of Luna, with the enemy commander telling the Emperor to call off his wolves, giving the legion its name. The culture and practices of the legion pre-unification and after were pretty similar. The reliance on the spear tip, the honorable warrior culture, all of it was there in spades, and made them easily one of the most famous legions all the way up to their eventual betrayal. In a similar manner, the Imperial Fist, whose original name is unknown to us, were always the way they were. Defensive warfare with a reliance and penchant on fortification building. This tendency was started during the Unification Wars, as during the battle where they conquered the fortress of the Fifth Circle, they were adept at taking and defending the strongholds they captured from the enemy, while waiting for reinforcements to arrive for a larger counter-assault. Their disposition, culture, and doctrine have always been the same, except for probably an arguably cooler and a bit more striking color scheme. They have always been the stalwart defenders of the Imperium they are to this very day. However, the same cannot be said for the Dusk Raiders or the Pale Nomads, also known as the Raven Guard. The early Raven Guards were honestly much closer to the modern day Night Lords or even the Alpha Legions in a lot of ways. When the Emperor needed an enemy demoralized or a group wiped out within a blink of an eye, the 19th were the Emperor's favorite. Well, outside of the assassins and other legions he had to do his dirty work. They were not looked on as a legion in a traditional sense by Astartes, as most of their history they were attached to the Luna Wolves and used by Horus as the stealthy arm of his legion. Many of these legionaries were not the brooding and more nuanced marines that we know today. Many would be outright maddened berserkers or sadistic monsters that due to the influence of the Sable brand would become a common occurrence in veteran troops within the legion. This was a much darker and crueler version of the legion, and one that if not tempered by the coming of the Raven Lord Corvus Corax, could have easily fallen into a much darker place. By a significant contrast, one legion that was arguably in a way better place before their Primarch is my beloved 12th Legion, the Warhounds. Out of many of the legions pre-unification, the Warhounds were on their own for a very long time, and arguably were one of the greatest Space Marine legions of the time. Not appearing much during the Unification Wars, the Warhounds, unlike other legions, would quickly come into their own and become a model legion for the other legions that were more decadent and vile throughout the Great Crusade. Their phalanx style combat tactics and close quarter focus was very useful for breaking enemy lines, and as such would be considered the best shock troops to have in the Imperium, next to the Luna Wolves. The exploits of the 13th Expeditionary Fleet being so well storied, it would go on to be known as the Bloody 13th. The Warhounds were the model Astartes that could have easily survived without their Primarch just fine. A couple legions that honestly needed their Primarch by contrast were that of the 3rd and 15th Legion. The 3rd Legion's original name is unknown. It can be inferred they were known as the 3rd, alongside having the same color scheme as far as we know. The 3rd were created later into the Unification Wars, not seeing any real combat on Terra until the beginnings of the Great Crusade. Many recruits of the Legion, both early on and after the Unification, were of noble blood, taken from the families of royalty and noblemen all around the European peninsula. The result was a legion of highly decorated and disciplined legionaries, being very much so quality over quantity, but not at their own fault. A gene seed flaw of unknown origin, commonly theorized to be the meddlings of the Chaos Gods, brought the legion down from normal legion size to about roughly 300 Astartes. As such, during their time as a legion, they would often fight in crusade flights attached to larger legions, the Luna Wolves in particular. The coming of Fulgrim would not only allow them to have a consistent and stable gene seed, but for the legion to fully rebuild. The Thousand Sons by contrast were far more temperamental. The legion itself was always few in numbers, its name of the Thousand Sons being in reference to the fact that at the dawn of the Great Crusade, the legion was declared as such by the Emperor himself, due to the fact that they had exactly 1000 marines to compromise the entire legion. This is not of how late they were created, far from it actually, as they were one of the first to be created, but they were so few in number due to the issues with their gene seed compatibility that would continue to haunt them until late after the Heresy Wars. For the first few years they were a standard legion, using adaptable and useful tactics until the entire legion spontaneously developed psychic powers all at the same time. This would give them the specific niche they would fall into, being the champions of the burgeoning librarians. However, the gene seed would also result in them just melting down into mush. So these gifts they had were often a point of contention, because those in the Imperium thought that the idea of psykers being used as combat troops was a really bad idea. Despite this, they would maintain a stellar combat record and were highly thoughtful and useful legionaries that could deal with a variety of things standard legions could not. But the greatest departure was that of their color scheme, which was a more creme metal color with blue and orange highlights. It would only be after the reunification with Magnus to Red that he would finally stabilize their gene seed issues, and unwittingly dam his entire legion in the same fell swoop. One legion that took a major departure from their original incarnation was that of the 14th Legion, the Dusk Raiders. This legion was not even close to its later incarnation, as its combat doctrine was entirely dissimilar compared to the full frontal and grinding assaults the 14th would become known for. During the Unification Wars, the Dusk Raiders would become vitally feared by enemy forces, as their half-skull, half-moon insignia was more than just a neat design, but a statement of intent, as those who knew of their legend would know that when the sun fell, the Raiders would come, resulting in many battles beginning with the enemy surrendering before anything could even happen. This was often repeated during the Great Crusade, as even fearsome Xenos and barbaric human factions could not deny the terror the Dusk Raiders would bring to their worlds. Their color scheme is absolutely stellar, featuring steel, crimson and a brass color on the trip that really sells a more minimalist but thoughtful approach, similar to how they carried out their style of warfare. Another legion that in many ways was minimalistic in appearance but complex in execution was that of the 17th Legion, then known as the Imperial Heralds. The Imperial Heralds were designed and trained to spread the Imperial truth, the decree that science, equality, should take precedence over any other religion, superstition, and fear that had dominated the human race for thousands of years. During both the Great Crusade and Unification Wars, they would re-educate populations brought into the fold of the Imperium, and would be the moral center of the ideology the Emperor was so desperate to instill into humanity. They would completely destroy and rebuild societies, many of them would become some of the Imperium's most stalwart and stable worlds even 10,000 years later. One legion of particular importance was that of the 4th Legion. This legion was closer to say the modern Ultramarines, albeit a bit more direct and brutal. They would adapt in combat and use their innate attraction to use technology to gain an advantage in battle. Despite their more tempered and thoughtful style of warfare, they would be unrelenting and would not stop until the battlefield itself was ground into dust. This was a style they would perfect during the Unification Wars, as they were one of the 3 big legions, next to the 1st and 5th Legions, to really see combat during the reunification of Terra. And they would continue to be quite effective, all the way throughout the Great Crusade, until getting absolutely decimated by their Iron Father. Speaking of the 5th Legion, before they were known as the White Scars, they were the Star Hunters. This legion was almost an entire legion of well-known scout companies, making sure their cousin legions were best equipped to properly tackle the battles ahead of them. They would take out any crucial targets, and honestly acted more like real marines than any other space marine. And throughout the Unification Wars especially, many battles would be won due to their intervention and intel they would provide to the Imperial forces. But due to their spread out and often disconnected nature, the Legion itself was a legion in name only. They would recruit on their own and often just painted their armor whatever camouflage was fitting for their planet or region. They were hard military men, and more often than anything acted far closer to, let's say, the Raptors, compared to their reunification with their Primarch White Scars. The 10th Legion was back in the day known as the Stormwalkers. They were a stalwart band of utilitarian men, willing to do anything and everything to make sure victory was achieved. They were brutal, savage, and during the later parts of the Unification Wars and Great Crusade, they would make a name for themselves for being the legion you would want if something had to die really fast. Their time away from their Primarch Ferrus Manus was brief, as he was only the 4th Primarch to be found during the Great Crusade. But regardless, the Stormwalkers will be a venerable foe worthy of the greatest of battles. The 13th Legion would go on to become easily the most famous and largest legion and chapter of Space Marines, but their beginnings were both humble and quite different. Before they would become known as the Roman-inspired warrior kings, they were called the Warborn. The Warborn were not the more methodical and regimented legion they would later become. Although according to reports on implantation candidates, the gene seed they used enhanced their aggression and adherence to structure. but many were recruited from the children of the last bastions of resistance during the late parts of the Unification Wars, meaning these were hard, strong men with a willingness to fight to the very last man. As a result, it became very clear early on that they were ideal for combined arms warfare and working well with other legions, and that they could adapt quite easily, making their work with the Proto-Iron Warriors quite understandable. However, one aspect that almost instantly manifested itself was their tendency towards heightened aggression, something that their Primarch would soon desire to temper. Another interesting thing was their colors and heraldry, as before reunification, many individuals in the Legion would have unique colored armor segments or symbols to signify personal victories, or victories of a specific squad or company, something no other Legion did, and I think it looks really cool. Overall, the Warborn, while smart and thoughtful, were more brutal at large, but despite these shortcomings, it was quite clear they were destined for greatness. One legion that even before the reunification was quite concerning was the 8, called the Night's Children. This legion was the one that was shrouded in darkness, both metaphorically and physically. From the beginning they were made for something many legions were uncomfortable with doing, being recruited from the children of the worst hives possible on Terra, and as such were designed to not just eliminate, but make a show of what happens when you defy the Emperor's will. Their penchant for a malicious and honestly barbaric slaughter of anything was designated an enemy of the Imperium, but it was also encouraged and nurtured during the Unification Wars by the Emperor himself. So when the 8 would set out into the galaxy during the Great Crusade, they would be so feared that most worlds, even out of reach of the Imperium, knew of their exploits and the horrors they would cause to their planet. The last Space Marine Legion we are gonna cover today was the 18th Legion, then known as the Dragon Warriors. Created alongside the Alpha Legion and Space Wolves for specific purposes we do not actually know. This legion was very different to its later more compassionate and fire-loving counterpart. They were attrition warfare specialists, and in their very first engagement, during the tail end of the Unification Wars, they would go against the remnants of Dark Age AI constructs inside a city-sized bunker deep underground in order to knock out the defenses of one of the last remaining cities on Terra. They had to use their hands and the weapons of their enemies to wipe out the constructs, sustaining almost 90% casualties during this first engagement. This penchant for extreme attrition warfare was just the tip of the iceberg, as their preference for more extreme devices like rat weapons and their constant use as soldiers willing to die in the last stand no matter the odds, made them both stalwart beacons of heroism and some of the most grim, darkest Astartes to ever walk the galaxy. In summary, the Legiones Astartes we know and love were often much more different than we would think, but those differences are what make them special and so enjoyable. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.